In the early morning hours of August the 16th, 2008, a fire was set in the Scott household and 6-year-old Mason Scott died as a result of the fire. Dr. Emily Ward, a pathologist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, testified that Mason died from smoke in his airway and thermal burns. At the time of the fire, his mother, Christie Scott, and her 4-year-old son Noah were sleeping in Scott's bedroom. Mason was in the boys' bedroom and Jeremy Scott, Christie Scott's husband, was not at home and had been out of town for several weeks. Sergeant Brian Shackelford of the Russellville Police Department testified that he arrived minutes after the emergency call, that he kicked open the back door, and that he was only able to make it 4 or 5 feet inside the house because of the heat and smoke. Firefighters testified that after extinguishing the fire, they searched the house several times before they were able to identify Mason's badly charred body. Christie Scott's neighbor, Jennifer Davidson, testified that her doorbell rang around 2:30 a.m. on August 16, 2008. She opened the door and it was Christie with her son Noah. Christie told her, "My house is on fire." Davidson went to the back of the house to telephone emergency 911 because she said the telephone in the front of the house was not working. When she got back to the front door, she said Christie told her that her other son Mason was still in the house. After police and firefighters arrived at the scene, Davidson stayed with Christie. Davidson testified that when Christie was in the ambulance, she said, "Don't call Jeremy. Don't call Jeremy. He'll blame me or he'll try to hurt himself." Davidson also heard Christie ask, "Which fire marshal is at the scene? This is peculiar. Why would you be asking about a particular fire marshal? Who even knows a fire marshal? Isn't it a good thing you don't know one?" More on that later. Christie said that she did not like one of the fire marshals because he had worked her other house fire. Davidson's boyfriend, Brian Copeland, testified that Christie came to the door of the house he shared with Davidson in the early morning hours of August 16th and told him that there was a fire. Copeland ran to Christie's house to try and find a way inside to help Mason. Copeland said that Scott told him that all the doors were locked and there was no way to get inside the house. That Christie did not enter any numbers in the keypad to open the garage door in his presence. An emergency medical technician with Pleasant Bay Ambulance Services, LZ Malone, testified that he responded to the fire. He said that Christie told him that she was alright and she did not need to go to the hospital. Malone said that Christie then said, "How am I going to tell Jeremy that I let our baby die?" Captain Steve Thornton with the Russellville Fire Department testified that he arrived at the scene after the fire had been extinguished. The fire, he said, originated in Mason's and Noah's bedroom. He said that some sort of electrical outlets from the bedroom were cut out of the wall in his presence. Dolan Gassett, a deputy fire marshal, testified that he found a disabled smoke detector in the hallway outside the boys' bedroom. Morris Brown, a former firearms and tools mark expert with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, he said that in his opinion, the smoke detector had been forcibly removed. He said some force acted upon the wires enough to cause the tearing of this house and cause the collateral abrasion of the wire. Testing indicated that the smoke detector would have worked properly if it was attached to the wall at the time of the fire. James Edwards, a deputy with the State Fire Marshal's Office, testified that he interviewed Christie at the Russellville Fire Department on August 26th. Scott gave the following account of events of August 16th. She said, "I went back to watch TV. I was watching HBO. I went back to check on them at 10 p.m. She's referring to her boys. Mason was asleep and Noah was not. I turned on the satellite and told him that he needed to go to sleep. I went back to watch my movie. The movie went off around 11 p.m. I went in the room to check on the boys. The TV was off and Noah was still awake. I told him to come in bed with me. We went to my room and went to bed. As I went to sleep, the house was fine. the Jack and Jill bathroom light was on and the night light played and plugged into the wall. In my room, I had turned the light on over the toilet for Noah Riley. We went to sleep. So according to her, Noah couldn't sleep, was awake, so when she went to bed, he went to bed with her. The next thing I remember is something hitting my face. As I started to wake up, I could smell the smoke and feel the heat on my face. I rolled off the bed and covered Noah and told him to be still. I crawled over to the door. I looked out in the hallway, which was covered in smoke. I could see flickering that I thought at the time was coming from the laundry room. I went back into our room, pushed the door. I crawled back over the bed and pulled Noah off in the floor. He began to cry at this point. I took a deep breath, stood up, and opened the window. I punched the screen out. I picked up Noah, kissed him, told him I loved him, and dropped him out of the window. At this time, I could hear crackling and popping. I began to try to get out the window, got halfway out and fell. When I got on the ground, I took Noah by hand and started around the house. He told me that I was hurting him, so I picked him up and carried him through the front yard with me. So here she is saying that she woke up, there's a fire, and I jumped out the window. The fire was coming out of the window in the boys' room and going over the top of the roof. It was orange. I ran to Jennifer's house, banged on the door. When she came to the door, I handed Noah to her, told her to call 911 and that the house was on fire. I yelled to her that Mason was still in the house as I headed back to the house. So that was her version of events. Now, a psychiatrist, Dr. Rebecca Daly, testified that Mason was brought to her for an evaluation in April 2007. She diagnosed Mason with ADHD and pervasive developmental disorder. She prescribed Abilify for his obsessive behavior, Risperdal as an antipsychotic, and Vyvanse for his hyperactivity. Now, on a side note, I don't think a child should be prescribed all those drugs. Am I wrong? It just doesn't feel right. Brain isn't fully developed. What are you doing? The same doctor, Dr. Daly, said the last time she saw Mason was 12 days before his death. A pediatrician, Dr. Duane Carter, testified that on February 6, 2008, he diagnosed Mason with bronchitis and prescribed an antibiotic, a steroid drug called Decadron, and a codeine-based cough syrup whose generic name is promethazine. He prescribed promethazine again on April 16, 2008. Dr. Carter testified that the cough syrup would make a child sleepy. A toxicologist at the Department of Forensic Sciences, Dr. Jack Kalin, analyzed Mason's blood. He identified the following drugs in Mason's system: amphetamines, codeine, and promethazine, an antihistamine typically used to treat nausea in post-operative patients. He said that the amphetamine level in a typical child being treated for ADHD is less than 100, but in Mason's level, it was at 450, a level that's only really seen in DUI cases. Was this done deliberately? Dr. Kalin further testified that this was the first case where he had seen codeine used in conjunction with promethazine and that both substances would induce sleepiness and drowsiness. Dr. Kalin said that he did not find the presence of Risperdal or Abilify in Mason's blood. Mason's carbon monoxide level, he said, was greater than 90%, which is extremely high. The state's experts ruled out lightning, spontaneous combustion, rechargeable batteries, and faulty electrical wiring as the cause of the fire. Michael Haynes, with the State Fire Marshal's Office, testified that there was no indication that any hydrocarbon accelerant had been used. Dr. Raphael A. Franco Jr., an electrical engineer, testified that he was asked to examine the scene to determine whether the fire was electrical in origin. He said he went to the scene and stayed there for 12 hours conducting his examination. He first went to the 5 outlets in the boy's bedroom, that the wiring ran under the floor, that the outlets were all on one circuit breaker, that he inspected every outlet and receptacle except outlet number 1, that he took over 400 photographs of the scene, he examined the wiring underneath the house, and he examined the attic, and he concluded that the nightlight was not the cause of the fire. The state presented numerous witnesses who testified concerning Christie's behavior immediately after the fire, which was inconsistent with the grieving parent. Anna K. Greenhill, a hairstylist at Hello Gorgeous, testified that on the day of Mason's death, Christie and Jeremy came to the shop for Jeremy's scheduled appointment. She said that they joked and bantered about how long Jeremy's hair had gotten, but did not mention Mason's name at any time during the 20-minute appointment. Heather McAlpin, who was married to one of Scott's cousins, testified that at the funeral, Christie held her daughter and said, "Noah's always wanted a baby sister, maybe he can get one now." Witnesses testified that Christie had been cruel to Mason in public, the last time being on the morning of the fire when Christie took Mason to school, where she spoke harshly to him and pushed him. Other witnesses testified that Christie had verbally abused Mason and that she had yanked his hair, shoved him, and hit him on the back of the head to make him be quiet. Another witness testified that after the fire, Christie told him she did not know how she could be so unlucky, that she had 3 house fires in 2 years, and that God was punishing her for not wanting to raise Mason, an autistic child. And this is the crux of the story. Who has 3 house fires in this short amount of time? This is what the prosecution were focusing on. They felt she did it deliberately. The evidence also showed that Christie had obtained 2 life insurance policies on Mason and Noah within months before Mason's death, and on August 15, 2008, had applied for a 3rd life insurance policy, so another policy a day before the fire. Robert Robinson, a senior vice president for Alpha Insurance, testified that Alpha had 2 life insurance policies on Mason Scott. The first policy, issued on May 6, 2008, was for $50,000. A second policy, issued on June 14th, was for $25,000. So they valued their children at around $75,000. You muppets. Jeremy and Christie Scott were the beneficiaries of the policies, Robinson said. A check from Alpha had been issued to the Scotts for $25,000 after Mason's death, but Alpha declined to pay the remaining amount because Christie had omitted information concerning Mason's health and his medications on the application for the $50,000 policy. I guess she did not read the fine print. Lee Janasek, a director of claims for the Woodman of the World Insurance Company, testified that Christie obtained a 3rd life insurance policy on Mason in the amount of $100,000. He further testified that Christie failed to indicate in her policy application that Mason had health problems or that medication had been prescribed for his condition. David Swindle, a claims supervisor with Farmers Insurance, testified that after the August 2008 fire, his company settled with the Scott family on their homeowner's policy and paid them $188,000 for the dwelling, $60,000 for its contents, and $5,500 for living expenses. Russell Yorn, a chief investigator for the Office of Prosecution Services, testified that he supervised the forensic examination conducted on the computer taken from the Scott's residence. He examined the internet search history. He said the computer was used to search numerous real estate sites for houses for sale. Also, at 1 a.m. on the morning of August 16th, the computer showed that a user accessed the site boaterexam.com. This website is to get a boat license. Either they were trying to buy a boat with the money, or maybe this was an escape route. Who knows? There was also testimony that the day before the fire, Christie had asked the teacher if her house was for sale. Evidence was also presented indicating that 2 fires had occurred at their previous residence on Steel Frame Road in 2006, and that as a result of the second fire, they had received over $185,000 in insurance monies. I mean, these people were fire salesmen, if you know what I mean. A real estate broker, Willow Dean Davis, testified that in May 2005, her company, Davis Realty and Associates, listed the Scott's house on Steel Frame Road for sale. Davis testified that the house did not sell in the 6-month listing period and that the Scotts did not relist the house. Kirk Berryman, a former agent with Farm Bureau Insurance, testified that in February 2005, he sold the Scott's insurance for their home on Steel Frame Road in the amount of $116,000. In December 2005, he said the Scotts increased the coverage to $139,000, the maximum amount it could be increased without a new appraisal. So you're seeing a pattern of behavior. Different addresses they live in, different policies they take out, and every time they file a claim for some kind of house burning. But then, what about Mason Scott? Him being there, alone. Mommy, mommy, daddy, daddy. Imagine that moment where he's there by himself and his body's burning. These sick motherfuckers. A ring valued at $14,000 was added to the insurance policy in November 2005. On January the 12th, 2006, the first fire occurred at the Scott residence on Steel Frame Road. The fire, though, was ruled an accident. It started when a pizza box was left on top of a hot burner. Little damage was done to the house and few repairs were necessary. It seems like in this fire business, they started small. The second fire, which occurred on January the 14th, 2006, started in the kitchen and destroyed the Scott's house. Dwight Walden, a fire investigator, testified that in his opinion, the second fire was intentionally set. There was also evidence that Christie was the last individual to leave the house before that fire, that Christie had increased her insurance coverage 3 months before that fire, and that the smoke alarm had been disconnected when the house was being cleaned. As a result of the second fire, the Scotts received insurance monies of over $185,000. In her defense, Christie presented the testimony of 2 experts in fire investigations and numerous friends and family members. The experts testified that the August 16, 2008 fire was accidental and started in the enclosed wooden television cabinet in the children's bedroom. Defense experts testified that the state's experts had based their arson determination on outdated methods, that the state investigation had numerous flaws, and that the state's experts erred in concluding that the fire originated near Noah's bed. It was their opinion that the fire was a closed cabinet fire because of the high level of carbon monoxide in Mason's blood. Personally, I don't know, I'm not a fire expert. Scott testified in her own defense and said that approximately 11 p.m. the day before, on August the 15th, she turned off her television and went to check on her sons. Noah was still up, and she said to him, "Come to bed with me," as previously mentioned in her police interview. Then around 2:30 a.m., she said she was awakened when Noah slapped her on the face. She smelled smoke and tried to get to Mason's bedroom, but was unable to do so because of the thick smoke and intense heat. Christie also testified that she dropped Noah out of the window in her bedroom, jumped out herself, and ran to her next-door neighbor's house for help. She said that she returned with her neighbor and tried to get back into the house. She said she pushed the code in, it wouldn't go in, and her hands were jerking. She thought it may be that her hands were jerking so bad that she started hitting the wrong buttons. So she told Brian Copeland the code, and Brian pushed in the code and it wouldn't open. She said she tried to put in the code herself 6 times. Christie also testified that she gave Mason a teaspoon of cough medicine the evening before the fire because he was coughing. A good portion of Christie's testimony was inconsistent with the testimony of numerous state witnesses. Now, in rebuttal, the state presented the testimony of Jim Hanana with the State Fire Marshal's office. He testified that Jeremy Scott initially cooperated with police and told them that Christie said to him at Mason's graveyard, "What do you think about having another child now?" Kelly Bragwell testified that she was related to Scott's husband by marriage. She said that she retrieved some jewelry out of the house about 1 week before the fire. Bragwell further testified that Christie told her that her nice wedding ring was not in the house at the time of the fire, but was at her mother's house. Convenient? Maybe. So eventually, the jury chose not to believe Christie's version of events. She was found guilty and she was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder. A separate sentencing hearing was held. Scott presented the testimony of more than 20 family members, friends, and clergy members. The jury recommended, by a vote of 7-5, that Scott be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the circuit court held a separate hearing declined the jury's recommendation and sentenced Christie to death. The court found two aggravating circumstances: that Scott murdered her son Mason for pecuniary gain, and that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel as compared to other capital murders. The court also found as non-statutory mitigating circumstances that Christie was loved, that Scott's death would have an impact on her surviving son, that Scott had helped people throughout her life, and that the jury had recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But after weighing all of this, they were like, sorry mate, we're going to sentence you to death. So what do you think of this? I don't know. Because I do feel, looking at the evidence, the repeated history, she did do this on purpose. At the same time, it's actually very hard to prove. That's probably why I'm not a lawyer, and that's why I'm behind this screen trying to act all professional. So why don't you guys comment, tell me what you think.